Hi, I am John-Paul Ferguson. I go by JP, but I often point out, especially since arriving in Montreal, that I am not named Jean-Paul comme les Québécois, mais John-Paul comme les redneck Américains. My mother's family are from Texas and Oklahoma and in the south of the United States. It's very common to give boys double-barreled first names, which of course we inherited from Acadians who were resettled in that part of the country. But it's a real pleasure to be here today, talking to all of you. I have an odd bio in a sense for someone who's giving a presentation about strategy, in that, as Pam mentioned, I'm a professor of organizational behavior here at McGill. Now, don't get too hung up on those disciplinary labels. Let me just mention that for many, many years, before I came to McGill, I taught in California at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, where strategy and organizational behavior were just a single class. And so I'm used to talking about sort of external product market facing strategy and organizational design, and that is all the elements of executing a strategy as just sort of one and the same process. And that's going to show up in that occasionally I jump back and forth between talking about strategies based on things like products and strategies based on like something we're trying to accomplish inside the firm. So I titled today's talk Prospective Strategy. And let me just dive into that immediately by saying the very rough outline for what we're going to do over the next 40 minutes or so is talk about what that is, how it's different, and why it is useful. And because it's not a mystery, what I'm leading you into, I'm happy to give you some spoiler alerts at the beginning with the confidence that by the end of the talk, all of these things I'm saying will make sense. So I want to stress to you first that prospective strategy, as I see it, is just a way of incorporating uncertainty about the world into your planning process, which I think a lot of traditional strategy, as it is taught in many, many business schools and frankly, a lot of popular books, tries to ignore. It's going to rely on valid and sound arguments. And I'll talk about the distinction between those. And then probably the thing that makes the very least sense at the start, but I hope will feel just kind of intuitive by the end of this talk, is when I say that prospective strategy is qualitative Bayesian updating. That's not meant to scare you off. I want to basically draw a number of links between the strategy process as it is best practiced and a lot of other intellectual developments that you see, particularly around things like data and analytics and decision-making in businesses in recent years. And so that's where we're going to start from. But I have to stress right at the beginning here that for me, when I say prospective strategy, I'm obviously drawing a contrast for a moment between something that obviously we should refer to as a non-prospective strategy. And this is the first point where it also helps me take the temperature of the room. If you have the chance, I'd love if you could just type in the chat what you think strategy is. This is one of those terms I think that people come to business school to learn, even though they're not necessarily sure what it is. And so what do you think strategy is?
Gets thrown a lot in meetings too, right?
Or drugs and vaccines and biomedical products.
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm gonna ask mostly because we end up with a huge amount of crosstalk when we have a very large meeting. If folks don't mind typing in the chat, I'm not trying to shut you down. I'm trying to hear you, which is why it's easier for me to read. Absolutely. So notice what starts streaming in almost immediately.
Yeah. So a lot of people are saying a plan series of moves, choices, a vision, game plan, targeted plan, a method about how to cope with a subject, collaborative planning, roadmap. So a lot of good adjectives in there. Organized journey.
And there's a lot in there, for example, about longer term approaches, having a clear target, how we're going to achieve an outcome, et cetera, et cetera. And like none of these are wrong. Notice, for example, that, I mean, at a very basic level, we use the term, we stole strategy from military treatises, right? It's the difference between strategy and tactics. The idea that tactics is how you fight a battle, strategy is you decide whether to fight that battle in the first place, go around the army, blockade them, starve them out, or do something else. Usually our business strategies are less violent than military strategies, but the basic idea, for example, that it's supposed to be some sort of detailed plan shows up repeatedly. And I think that's right. In fact, To this day, the most useful, I think, generic definition that I have for strategy is that it's a plan to achieve a goal. And we can add any number of things on top of that, but those are just there to provide full employment for professors and consultants by making the concept sound fancier than it is. Strategy is a plan to achieve a goal. And so when I say that something is non-prospective, I have to be careful here, because you might think, well, if the whole purpose of a strategy, if indeed its very definition is that we're planning in order to achieve some future goal, then strategy has to be prospective. It has to be forward-looking. But that's not usually how we teach it. And I think we all agree on that definition, and yet we often seem to disagree on the tools that we convey to people when teaching about strategy. I think many of the tools that we teach are necessary for good strategic planning, but insufficient. And it's sort of the missing piece that I want to spend time talking about today. Let me give you two examples of the way that strategy is often taught or conceived empirically. And I think you're going to notice how those don't necessarily jibe with the definition as we have described it so far. And I think actually a useful place to start is with something concrete. So I'm just going to show you a picture of a bicycle. This is actually a bicycle that's outside the doorway of my office here. Anyone who knows me at McGill knows I'm a nerd for bike mechanics. I build bicycles in my spare time, teach people how to build them, and so on. And this is another sort of question for the chat. If you have ever heard about components on a bicycle, like, I'm going to ignore the frames, but particularly things like the drivetrain or the shifters that help you change gears or so on. Like, what are companies you've heard of when it comes to bicycles? If anyone who considers themselves a bike geek is on this call, Shimano are the first two answers. I'm curious to see, like, that's really striking. For those of you, SRAM, a competitor of Shimano, right? And then we start to get some more ones. And I do love CCM. And that's when I have to acknowledge, yes, I'm in Canada now. Trust me, no one outside of Canada knows what CCM is. Physique, which makes bar tape, Norco, Louis Garneau, Kona, many of these are frame manufacturers. Cervelo is the same way. The fact that Shimano were the first two and that those showed up immediately is kind of relevant if you wanted to make a story about strategy in the bicycle industry. For those of you who aren't familiar with bicycles, let me just stress, Shimano makes the drivetrain components for bicycles. This, for example, is the thing that allows you to shift the gears on the bicycle, referred to as a dérailleur, or outside of Quebec as a derailleur. This is a Deor, which is just a model name produced by Shimano. And in fact, Shimano accounts for about 10%, their parts account for about 10% of the production cost of a bicycle, and yet Shimano takes home about 18% of the profits associated with a new high-end bicycle. And we could tell an interesting story here about why Shimano has been so very successful at capturing that market. Just as a comparison, I took a gamble and was correct that yes, this is a Shimano. On the other hand, if I show you my seat post and mention that it's a Thompson, no one listed Thompson as a component manufacturer in the chat here. And that's because, let's be honest, almost no one cares about seat posts. And Thompson, seat posts, they're only a small amount of the production cost of a bicycle, usually about 1 or 2%, but they also take home a disproportionately small share of the profits of a new bicycle, often as little as half of 1%. So there's something here we could talk about why Shimano has been so much more successful at gaining profits in the bicycle industry. And you could imagine there's a very deep rabbit hole we could go down, but suffice to say, I've taught a case about Shimano for many years, and we can work through both where their capabilities as an organization came from, that this is a firm that really has a specialty in what's called cold forging of metal, which is very useful for producing shaped metal parts like these very cheaply. They also are very good at developing a relationship with the end customer, which is to say, those of you that know their name. In fact, for many years, when you would talk to someone about a bicycle and you tried to get a sense of whether or not it was a good bike, they would tell you what model of Shimano parts were on the bicycle. Indeed, in many cases, Shimano had a better reputation than a lot of its the frame makers upon which its parts were installed. And so we could go on and we could have a great discussion about how Shimano ends up being incredibly important, having something like an 85% market share at the top of the market for bicycles. We could talk about their plan for how they created and captured value. And I have a long, detailed list of arguments I could give you about that. And indeed, that's something that we do in a lot of strategy classes. And for what it's worth, it jives beautifully with a lot of the models and frameworks, which if you've taken a strategy class, you've probably seen. You can do a wonderful industry analysis of the high-end bicycle industry. Use Michael Porter's 5 forces, for example, to talk about buyer and supplier power, the threat of substitutes, and so on, and make almost a textbook case for why this company was successful. But my experience has been, and this is sort of the genesis of this talk, that after doing a number of these kind of strategy cases, I will usually have a student either ask in class or more often come down after class to ask me because they feel embarrassed, like they're missing something about the strategy class. And they say, it's a great story, but like, what am I supposed to do with this information? Right? Like, okay, I understand that Shimano is really good at cold forging steel. I don't know what that is. Right? And this is, I think it's pretty common, right? That in a lot of strategy classes, we spend time teaching people the stories of a person or an organization's route to success. And they're fun to teach. They have little examples and opportunities. We get to explain the problems that they solved. I want to stress, by definition, this kind of strategy is retrospective. We're looking back over the history of the company and talking about how it succeeded. And I think if you're sitting in that class, that's neat, but that question of what I should do with this information, here is where I want to stress. The students who come down and ask me about that are my better students. They are the ones who are starting to notice, how can I use this information, right? And this is the problem with that kind of retrospective strategy. Often it feels like, the real problem with your company is you didn't found it in 1947. Right? Or like the case itself isn't something that you get to replicate. And sort of even nastier, what we end up doing is we just present a series of concrete examples, sort of with the hope you can induce the strategic planning process from those cases. And so this is sort of version 1 of a type of strategy that I find unsatisfying, because it's important, and all of those tools of industry analysis, for example, that we use cases to illustrate matter, but that sense of how Shimano came up with the plan, what Shimano did with that plan, often gets lost in the way that we traditionally teach strategy. The other thing that was really striking, as I just scroll backwards quickly through the chat, was the number of times you had things like detailed plans, steps we're going to take, concrete actions that reach towards this outcome. And this gets us into what many of you have probably dealt with, which is to say the strategic planning process or the strategy process in many companies, right? And that has a very common feel where strategy seems less like a fun story full of examples and opportunities, and maybe instead has, I don't know, some sort of checklist or item you're supposed to go through and figure out, boxes you have to fill out. I mean, it could look like a scorecard, it could be one of these pestle analysis. You could have maybe some toolkits, some other items. You might think about the org chart. Ultimately, there's a tremendous number of forms that eventually go into one of these that, in my experience, after 3 or 4 years, goes into one of these, which is to say that strategy in many, many organizations that I have been a part of, or that I have consulted with, strategy has a very sort of dry and formal definition that shows up, that people dread the idea of sitting down for a strategy process, because this is sort of that other version of non-prospective strategy as it is enacted in a large number of organizations. And like, it's a set of summaries and plans conceived of at fixed, often regular periods of time, meant to apply for a fixed period. These kind of strategies are full of those frameworks and templates and other items that are often taught as silver bullets for doing strategy. And here's where I want to stress something. What I almost never see in those kind of strategies that are eventually put together is contingencies. What if we're wrong? There's also a running question, why that particular length of time? Like, when should we reconsider? This is, again, a question for the chat for a moment. How long, if in your organization you've been involved in strategic planning, how long are those strategies meant to apply? Like, if you've been through one of these processes, I see forever, 3 years, 1 year, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5, 3 to 5, 10. You know, I give Derek credit for originality for going with 2, which is relatively rare. So yeah, what we tend to see is things like, so very rarely, so Rosetta and Benjamin, I see mentioning things like, see the results, or it depends, right? Some of you will mention to the end of the project or otherwise, which is good. Notice the majority of those examples are things like a number of years. And that raises the obvious question, why that length of time? Why do we reconsider at that moment? Shortly after I arrived, so I arrived at McGill, for what it's worth, in 2018. And we were still working on a strategy that had been devised in 2015 called Vision 2020. And in 2020, just before everything hit the fan with the pandemic, we were asked to start thinking about the next round of our strategy. It was originally called Vision 2025, and you could very clearly tell that the 5-year template was in everyone's head, because that raises the obvious question, wait, that means our vision's getting worse. Like, did you not notice that? Eventually, you know, we'd be at Vision 2050, it'd be apparently blind. You know, we're mostly being driven by the calendar. But it's really striking to me when I read a lot of the strategic plans that organizations create, that those strategy plans, in my opinion, are usually simultaneously too detailed and too vague. Often they include a list of competencies. They maybe have goals or specific objectives to reach. It is much rarer in seeing an organization's strategy to see a detailed argument for how those competencies help you meet those goals. And rarer still to find discussions of how we're going to know whether we're on track, other than milestones, which usually seem to be linear interpolations of the final goal projected backward through time. And I think that plans are quite important. But again, something seems to be missing here, because, and it comes, this definition of strategy is actually closer to the definitions that most of you gave at the start of this talk, which is to say a detailed plan to achieve a goal with a set of objectives. What is usually missing when I talk to people about strategy, even of this kind, is a sense of like, well, how do we know whether we're right? What would we do if we are wrong? How would we decide? You know, and so there's a tendency in both of these approaches to set aside uncertainty. And I want to stress why this is important for a couple of reasons. First, one of the things that leveled me up as a professor, actually, was I taught a few years ago for several years. I taught a series of workshops with business owners in Africa. And all of these folks were like ferociously competent entrepreneurs. You know, if you can build a thriving logistics enterprise in Lagos, you're amazing. Like, one of the hardest places in the world to get such a business up and running with relatively flawless delivery. And so the fact that they were unfamiliar and would push me on a lot of basic jargon that I would use as a business school professor was not lack of capability. It's simply that they hadn't grown up imbibing these terms in the water that they drink. And that was the first time when teaching strategy, when I had, rather than one student after class, I had an entire class asking me, well, what am I supposed to do with this information? Right? How am I supposed to go forward and use this? Because all of these cases that we're talking about assume that we have the entire history of the firm in front of us. And they present these problems as things that were surmounted, but they don't put us in the position of trying to surmount that problem, which is actually where I am as a business leader all of the time. And so that sense of, and you notice this, by the way, when you engage in that kind of planning process, we often have at best a set of like optimistic, realistic, and pessimistic scenarios with very little information specified about how we would decide between those scenarios. And it seems that the tendency in that first style of non-prospective strategy has been to simply table the problem by looking backward through time, versus a lot of modern detailed strategies. There's no room made for contingency. And there's no advice for the person who is supposedly implementing this strategy, how they're supposed to figure out or decide if they are on track. I personally think this is one of the main reasons that those strategy exercises so often end up going into binders, sitting on people's shelves and not really looked at until 5 years later when it's time to reconsider the strategy. On the other hand, I don't blame people for being nervous about dealing with uncertainty. Because, I mean, let's just keep it real for a moment. A strategy is a plan to achieve a goal. I'm asking you to think prospectively. So, simple question, and I'll ask again for a comment in the chat here. How do you know a plan is going to work? Okay, we have a sense of tasks. First main response, you don't. Review it at the end, you don't know for sure. You can monitor progress, try it, see what happens. Do your best, trial and error, see the end goal. These are all great answers, right? Well, some of them are good. They're not necessarily great. And so I'll accuse a few people of goodness. At the end or when it works, right, is a bit tautological. Like, you know the plan's going to work when it has worked. That doesn't really give me much reassurance. I see Jeff saying, my gut feeling is usually right. The problem is we can't necessarily clone your gut and give it to other people. And so we need something that's more generalizable, right? Some people are just saying trial and error. Perhaps, but I think most of us can understand that we are nervous about the idea that wouldn't we like to have something better than trial and error in deciding whether our plans are working, right? I see some other pieces about familiarity with the processes, you know, based on previous experience. Absolutely, Derek, that is possible. I just want us to notice, particularly when we're trying to do something new, we aren't necessarily going to have experiences that we can repeat. We also have people who have mentioned things like following best practices. As a strategy professor, that always hurts me, because I want to point out, if you're trying to differentiate yourself, relying on conforming to best practices by other people in your industry isn't necessarily that useful. Jason nails it by suggesting a time machine, which I agree would be the most straightforward example. And when one is invented, I will happily retire, but we're not there yet. Now, many of you mentioned things like KPIs or monitoring progress or so on. Those are correct, but we often want to ask ourselves why those KPIs as opposed to something else, particularly because when we're creating something new, we often have to define new indicators of progress. Again, I will speak briefly from experience. I teach at a business school. I also run the MBA program at our business school. I am very concerned with carving out a sense of why you would want to come to McGill for an MBA. And because it used to be easy, when we were publicly funded, we were the top program in Quebec, full stop. People came here because of that positional advantage we had. Over the last few years, though, as we moved toward a self-funded model and have become more of an international competitor, that positional advantage doesn't matter as much for people. And so then we need to find something very distinctive about McGill. Now, people often say, well, look at if you're rising in the rankings. But that is suicide for a school, because it's actually, if we just do nothing but conform to the rankings, then there's nothing that makes us stand out. And then it's just you're successful because you're successful, right? So we often have to think about things that we want to monitor separate from those ranking systems. So I notice as I've been discussing this, I'm starting to see a shift in the chat in the kind of things you're suggesting. Things like not just an educated guess, but like research, testing, prototype, getting feedback from people who are involved, maybe a pilot project, right? These kind of things start to become important. This is the direction we want to go, but we need a sense of what's missing from that is that often that sense of like, well, how do we choose which pilot projects? Just to be clear, most of you are correct in that, the answer here is that you don't. You don't know that a plan will work. And I think this is very important for us to keep in mind, that a strategy is a plan which we do not know in advance will work. And so we can restate this in saying, when are you more confident about a plan, right? And here, not even necessarily thinking about business strategies or otherwise, like think about in your life when someone has come to you and they're proposing a course of action. What makes you feel okay about going along with their plan? I'll come back to these points about building experimental features, for example. Like these are useful ones to have in the background, right? So Diana mentions data, that someone can back up their plan with data. Absolutely okay with that. Any other thoughts? What other things? Their track record, perhaps. Track record is often, and like we often summarize this per Ying's point about the person's credibility, right? These are useful. I want to encapsulate these and talk about them sort of all together in a simpler way. And so I'm going to suggest to you, one of the ways that we could talk about this is you are more confident about a plan when you believe the argument inside the plan, right? Because it's one thing, notice the risk in saying, I'm just going to use someone's track record. If we're trying something new, like that's a lot of trust. And, I think trust is important, but blind faith is risky, right? If we have, I think the idea that we have capabilities to execute on the plan, which I see people mentioning, that what we're proposing is in line with what customers, for example, are thinking about. Like all of those, notice, are parts of an argument. And it's this idea that a good strategy has a good and clear argument inside it, which is not just, and when I say argument, I don't just mean rhetorically, we can convince people, but that all of that plan and everything can be boiled down to an argument, which means not only is it convincing, but it can be tested. That, I think, is the missing piece in a lot of our discussions about how we put these plans into action. Now, lingo is important. When I say argument, I realize, particularly because I find Quebec is a less, shall we say, conflict-seeking society than New Jersey, where I'm originally from. When I talk about argument, you're thinking this. That's not actually what I mean by an argument, though those happen. I'm thinking more like this. And when I bring up formal logic, I realize this is where I lose half the room. But I want you to bear with me for a second. Because, by the way, I see many people mentioning things like trust and data as things that make you feel more confident about a plan. And I want to suggest that you are probably both right, but you're probably right for different reasons. And those different reasons map to the two things that we consider when we're trying to decide whether someone's argument is any good. And so let me talk about that. Okay, the classic way we discuss an argument and we decide whether it's a strong, convincing argument. Let me introduce, so I beat you to it slightly, Andrew, right? Soundness is part of it, but so is validity. And these are two terms that I think are very important for you to have an intuitive understanding of the difference between them. Validity is the idea, does this argument make sense? Does it have a clear logical structure, right? In other words, can I understand the assumptions that you are making at the beginning of the argument? And do I think that the conclusions follow from those assumptions? In other words, can you explain to me why, for example, those competencies that you listed in the strategy In what way, close the loop for me, how are those going to help us meet our particular goals? Now, the reason I'm drawing the distinction between validity and soundness is something else, right? If validity is asking, does your argument's conclusions follow from the assumptions? Validity is, do I believe the assumptions? Sorry, soundness. You can tell I'm drinking coffee during this talk. Soundness is a question of, do I believe the assumptions? Now, I see a couple of you saying a valid argument is also sound. Not true. Think about it. And actually, you can think about why that is the case, because these are actually the two main ways we also criticize people's arguments when they make them to us. How many times have you said to someone, I absolutely agree that this argument makes total sense if we assume that customers are willing to pay $100 for this product. But I don't think customers are willing to pay $100 for this product. At that point, you're saying that the logic of the argument is valid, but the assumption that we are beginning from is false. And that distinction is incredibly important for us to notice, because we have differing ability to investigate these two things. In particular, right? I just want to notice the, back and forth. So like valid arguments have true premises. Validity is something, a good argument has a valid logic and the premises are true. But often the difference that I'm trying to draw up, because I notice Camilo saying, could we say the logic of the argument gives us faith in the plan? And I'm going to say it should give you some faith, right? Because the question still remains, are the assumptions that we are making true? And that is the thing I want you to notice, because we can pick apart the validity of an argument in a room, in a lot of cases. But at the end of the day, if our disputes are about the soundness of an argument, then at that point, we have to go out into the world and we have to investigate things, right? And so if we need, and I follow, Linda, I take your point when you say you need to know your audience. Some people are unconvinced by logic. I agree on that completely. And I'm not making an argument simply but here's the thing. Where I think prospective strategy is incredibly useful is, sure, it's useful for convincing people, like board members, investors, employees, etc. But personally, I think that prospective version of strategy and where we want to go in terms of investigating these things, I think that is most important for convincing yourself. Because rhetoric I can use on other people. When I am using the rhetoric on myself, I should probably just quit, right? And so that feeling of, at the end of the day, I have to believe the argument. And so that discussion at some point starts to become incredibly important. Do I believe the assumptions that I'm making in this argument, right? And so this is the first piece I want to give you just to stretch out this idea, right? That prospective strategy, I'm going to say it's a plan to achieve a goal and it's supported by an argument. And this is what I think makes it prospective. First, we have to be clear when we make those kinds of arguments, what assumptions we are making. And that leads us into a position where we have to make contingency plans for what we're going to do if those assumptions are wrong. And we want to figure out ways whenever possible to test our assumptions. And so this is where we can start to fold in several of the things that each of you have pointed out during that chat. Those of you that were talking about pilot projects or prototyping, I think these are great ideas, right? Small experiments. And experiments can literally be, what happens if I call 5 people and I talk to them this way? We don't have statistical power, but sometimes if we're trying to evaluate the basic truth value of an assumption, that's a good starting place. And in each of those instances, the question then becomes, why are you doing that experiment as opposed to a different one? And this is where I think the power of thinking clearly about your argument and your assumptions that you make in that argument can be useful for strategy, because I often hear people saying, and this has been like, we have gotten better in the last 10 years because people are far more likely, as you have been in this chat, to talk about things like, we need data, we need experiments, we need pilot projects. What I hear less often is the people who are making the arguments for data or pilot projects, like, what is the argument for doing that pilot project, for gathering that particular data, right? And that, I think, starts to get at like the core question when you're doing prospective strategy is, I often find myself asking, what is the one piece of new information that would give me the most information on whether we're on the right track? And the strategy processes that go into binders rarely have this conversation. For what it's worth, I think that this is the question that, if you are doing strategy on a day-to-day basis, sort of sits at the core for many people, right? Just per the desperate question, yes, there's going to be a recording and we'll share the slides, have no fear. And I just like, if you'll indulge me for a couple of minutes at the end here, this is where I think we have lost the connection between strategy and a lot of other things that, frankly, we teach, and in some cases used to teach in business schools, and is increasingly used elsewhere in places like business analytics, that we need to bring the two back together, right? Now, if I say, like, what's the one piece of new information that would best tell me whether we're on the right track? Like, in other words, could we design an experiment that, based on that data, how is that going to change our prior assumptions? Brace yourself. This is where I want to talk about qualitative Bayesian updating. I'm going to talk about Thomas Bayes for a second. If you've ever had a statistics class, and I want to give a trigger warning for math, for those of you that did not love your statistics classes, but you probably saw something called Bayes' theorem at some stage, which is also known as the law of inverse probability. This is the version of saying, like, we think someone is guilty, we know, for example, and by the way, many of you have probably seen some version of this or obsessed over it in the last year and a half, because this shows up all the time in epidemiology, right? We have a positive test for COVID. Then the question becomes, what is the probability that I have COVID, conditional on having that positive test? This is why all those questions about things like reliability and accuracy, false positives and false negatives, when we look at things like epidemiology, Bayes' theorem is at its root. I don't really want to spend too much time on Bayes' rule, though. I just want to point out the basic essence of Bayesian reasoning, because it sort of gets mentioned once in a statistics class, and then we tend to throw it away, when in fact it's one of the most useful ideas that we have floating around when we're looking at uncertainty. And that's the idea that, and the simplest way to put this, I'll just say this once or twice so it's clear, like, your prior beliefs, when added with new data, yield a posterior set of beliefs. And formally, this is saying the prior times the data is proportional to the posterior. But all that means is gathering new data allows us to update our beliefs about the world. And the more data that we gather, right, the more we can update. If that data is useful, it'll either tell us that we're more right or more wrong. Now, Bayes developed those ideas as part of a complicated argument about trying to divine the existence of God. I don't propose solutions at that scale for strategy. But I really want to stress to you, one of the reasons why I think Bayesian reasoning is so nice to look at is that Bayesian reasoning gives us a way to quantify uncertainty and changes to uncertainty. To ask ourselves, first off, the idea that, like, whether we know something is not a yes, no, but there's some degree of knowledge that we have. I think the idea that none of us can ever be totally certain, but we can get closer and closer. And the idea that data can help decrease our uncertainty. All of those ideas, which underlie so much of modern decision theory, relate directly to the questions of strategy as an argument. Now, I'm not proposing, by the way, that you all drop what you're doing and take a course in Bayesian statistics. I bring this up more to show that when you think in this direction, you start to notice that other things you have been taught in a business school education, like actually feed directly back into strategy if we want to do it properly. For what it's worth, Bayesian statistics was basically shut down in the statistical establishment for much of the 20th century. And it tended to flourish off on the margins in places like public health departments and actually business schools. In fact, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, a guy named Robert Schlafer at Harvard paired up with a statistician he hired from Columbia named Howard Rafa, and the two of them essentially redefined Bayesian reasoning kind of from scratch, since it wasn't being taught elsewhere, and published analysis of decisions under uncertainty. And so when we talk about strategy as something that should be incorporating uncertainty, and when we want to make decisions under uncertainty, I want to point out every attempt of people to figure out ways to think prospectively, like these two are peanut butter and jelly together, and that we need to reincorporate that sense of uncertainty inside our teaching of strategy. And so I want to be clear that given that what you said at the beginning was a plan to achieve a goal, a plan that we're not sure whether it works, I think all of those things are correct, but that's not what we're teaching you in a lot of strategy classes. We teach you the tools, the frameworks, the checklists, the ways to do industry analysis and all of that. We teach you examples of those tools having been used in cases, but we rarely actually teach why you use those tools, when you should use those tools, and how you can put them together. Now, what I love is that question in the chat, but don't we have stuff like scenario planning? Yes, of course we do. And scenario planning, by the way, is one of the places where, but notice scenario planning is often rarely taught as part of the strategy process. And when it, like, I'm glad when it is, I try to teach it, but it has tended to disappear. And that sense of why we think that particular scenarios should be looked at ultimately boils down to the same kind of question. What would be the new piece of information that would make us most likely to say we're on the wrong track or we are indeed on the right track? If you've ever done things like decision trees, you know this is flipping decision trees. Like, what's the lowest node on the decision tree that we should think about reconsideration? And as several of you were mentioning, right? You know, we're presented with, like, this is why we want to revisit every 6 months to 1 year. I think building in a formal attempt to revisit strategies, yes, that's important, but my problem is that a lot of cases that I have been involved with in companies where we are going to try to revisit something on a fixed time interval, we might be able to learn far sooner than 6 months to 1 year. And by the way, to say that we're going to revisit our goals is very different from saying that we are going to potentially go out and try to gather information at times that will help us decide whether our goals are on track. Think about this for a moment. If there's a new piece of information that you haven't used to gather that would tell you whether you're doing things right, and you don't go out and gather that new information, it doesn't matter if you look 6 months from now and you find that you're not doing as well as you thought. You don't have the information to help you decide why you weren't doing as well as you thought. Diana, I will take the shout out from Lord Kelvin. That works very nicely, right? I think, let me end with a point about like how we do strategy in that sense, and just the things that I want to add. Everyone talks about identifying a goal. People talk about formulating plans to achieve that goal. I want to make sure about these next steps. I would like to hear the argument for why that plan is a good one. Obviously, that argument should have a logical structure. But if we make a clear argument, that's often when we have to identify the assumptions upon which that argument relies. right? Then, frankly, pick the assumption that you are least certain about, and then actively try to find some ways to test that assumption. And to me, that's the essence of prospective strategy. This is the thing that, as a director of a program, I find myself doing the most. What is information that we could collect that would help increase or decrease our confidence that we are doing the right kind of plan? So, let me give you my aphorism at the end here, right? I don't think any part of the strategic process is guaranteed to work. But that doesn't mean we should just, I think there's a tendency otherwise to be like, we have to have commitment and we just have to push this plan forward. Because if we don't have commitment, we're never going to actually do the thing. I've heard this said in strategy classes, and it makes me throw up in my mouth a little bit. No, we can commit to something and still be smart. We can try to work on something while simultaneously trying to gather information on whether it's working, right? Certainty is not an all or nothing prospect. We can do everything we need to execute while still trying to figure out ways to test and increase our confidence. So with that, I would like to just pause and thank you for all of your attention. And Pam, how would you most like to do the Q&A? Would you like just sort of questions in the chat at this stage?
Yeah, questions in the chat would be great.
So Nicole, and I apologize if I'm getting people's names wrong. This is why I did the John-Paul thing at the beginning. When you say this definition seems like the definition of a project plan, I hear you, but my experience has been most of the plans that I have seen, and frankly, the ones that I used to grade in the past and that people present me when I've been involved with organizations, very often they have a plan about what they're going to do. They have a plan about why it's going to work. They very rarely have a plan about how they're going to check that they are on track. At best, they say they're going to revisit things at some point. But of course you are. But why are you revisiting? How are you revisiting? What would be the information that you would want to gather when you revisit? Very rarely do I see that kind of stuff being discussed during the planning process. How can I find out more? Further readings. So I see several people, as other people are writing questions, let me jump ahead a slide or two. I've included some further readings. By the way, I saw someone mentioning that great book on, David Johnson's book on postmortems. I think David's book is great for discussing some of these questions about trying to figure out what it was that went wrong. Almost by definition, as a postmortem, he's proposing a retrospective look. But the sort of investigative process he's describing applied prospectively in terms of thinking about what pieces of information could we gather in advance? Are there small experiments that would give us information? We're coming at the same issue from different directions. So I would happily add David Johnson's book on postmortems. And in fact, I will probably add it to this further reading list. I really want to stress, this is the rare case of someone who's flogging a book that they get no royalties from, but this piece by Jesper Sorensen and Glenn Carroll, these are former colleagues of mine, and that book that they're doing is basically, it grew out of us teaching strategy, various sections for close to a decade together. And they published this book this year. I think it's a very nice encapsulation of the approach I've been talking about. I've linked to a bit of them talking about it. And per the question that came up in the chat about scenario planning, let me stress also, Lingard and Banhold's book is one of the best on scenario planning. I think that scenario planning is often taught in operations. And one of the things I want to stress here is even if only at a qualitative level, scenario planning is fundamentally important for people who do strategy to think through as well. Because a strategy that you don't stress test while it's in operation, at best you come back and you realize after the fact that, yeah, things aren't working, but you still don't have any greater confidence in why they aren't working. I also mentioned Schlafer's book because I think it's amazing to go back at this point, more than 50 years, and look at how at the start of a lot of these things, a lot of the basic questions that we get asked still aren't answered very well. And this is very much a case of going back to the future. I think reincorporating early decision analysis into strategy is very useful. So let me just mention on some of the other chats. So that was definitely the part about further reading. Sometimes from data, I can see, per Samantha's point, like sometimes from data, I could see something's not working after a month. Like that's the thing. I think, you know, a good manager has a set of hypotheses in their head, and they are always asking, how could I decide whether this is giving us information? Eric, per your point about pre-mortems, that's the term people sometimes use for we're setting up a sense of what would be the things we would want to look at after the fact. Let's look at them now. I think consulting with other people is, Jane, is a great starting place. I think the thing that can be missing here in the sense of like, I want to go out and I want to gather data and I want to run this by people. The reason I put so much emphasis on an argument is first I want to convince myself. And I want to ask, what would be the thing that would make me feel the most sure about this plan? If I could like suddenly have certainty, or at least more certainty about something, what would change my confidence the most? And that's as opposed to just going and presenting the entire plan and getting feedback from people, because their feedback isn't necessarily going to be based on the structure of the argument unless you've made it clear. They aren't necessarily going to push on the assumptions unless you've clearly identified them. As Adine's question about should you involve all employees or is this left only for managers? There's not, this is one of those like totally come take my class. I don't think there's one answer to this question. Not least because the idea that I'm making an argument and I want to stress test the argument, I often need the help of people beyond those in the strategic planning group to do that. But that doesn't mean having a group of people who work on crafting and thinking about arguments isn't useful. And perhaps, let's see, harder strategy, best way to approach a plan. Let me go with Rosetta and Rupin's questions as the last one, because I'm conscious of your time. I really appreciate people taking time out of the day for talks like this. On the question of how do we incorporate intuition in this process, I think that intuition is often there in the sense of establishing the goals. And I think intuition is also there in helping us make our initial assumptions. Right. And so then when I go back and I look through my argument, and when I say an assumption, of course, I just mean what are the things that have to be true about the world for this argument to make sense? That's often where my intuition has shown up. And then the question becomes, can I get some external validation of my intuition? I make assumptions all the time about what drives willingness to pay for an MBA. Right. And then I spend time interviewing applicants, students who accept, students who don't accept. I talk to employers who are considering paying for an MBA. Like I have my own theories about why people would pay for an MBA, but I want to test to see whether those theories are shared by other people in the world. And the point about strategies are harder than they need to be. I think that sense of like, what are the 2 or 3 things that are most important, that if we can't do those, like if these assumptions don't hold, the rest of the strategy doesn't work. That sort of brings us into a related question about execution. And to be honest, it's going to be outside the scope of the next 5 minutes to talk about Rosetta. But I think that I often say to people, trying to come up with 2 or 3 critical tasks, which is to say, what are the 2 or 3 things that if we can't do these, we shouldn't even bother having this strategy, is a wonderful place to start in asking, like, is this strategy practicable in terms of can we execute upon it? Let me see if we have last words or questions at this point. I would also second the foundations of decision analysis. The thing I want us to notice here is decision analysis is a tool, of course. And I think that it should be taught more. We're at a point where decision analysis has become so important in operations and machine learning that you can learn a tremendous amount about decision analysis at this point without ever learning anything about strategy. And conversely, you can take entire courses on strategy that don't spend time on decision making under uncertainty. And to me, that is when I say we're using the term wrong, because the separation of those 2 fields is where I think we've ended up with this retrospective approach to strategy. And we need to bring the 2 back in. And so with that, I am showing basically we're at time. Pamela, let me know what I have forgotten.
No, nothing. You haven't forgotten anything. So thank you very much, everyone, for all your questions and participation today. And thank you, JP, for this very, very informative lecture. I think it's very important. Just to let everyone know, within the next 24 hours, you'll be receiving an email from us with the recording of the session and this list of helpful resources and further reading so you can explore the subject. And just thank you again for attending. We'd love to stay connected, so please feel free to reach out to us, add us on LinkedIn, and subscribe to our mailing list. And our next session will be on Monday, September 27th, on implicit bias in the workplace. So another very timely topic. So have a wonderful week and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks all. Take care.